Lijep pozdrav svima u ime Centra za ženske studije. Kao što vidite sa naslovnog slajda, gost današnjeg podcasta je američki profesor Eric Fure-Slocum. Inače je profesor koji se bavi socijalnom historijom, radničkim pokretom i zapravo na neki način pokušava spojiti aktivizam sa onim što radi u akademskoj zajednici. Profesor je pozvan danas iz jednog specifičnog razloga, to je zapravo što nam je otkrio jednu od hrvatskih žena koja se zapravo 30. godina preselila u Sjedinjene Američke Države i tamo postala značajna figura kako američke ljevice, tako zapravo i američkog radničkog pokreta. Kasnije se uključila i u niz ljevičarskih organizacija, bila je protivnica rasizma, uključila se i u tu cijelu antirasističku priču u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama od 30. 40. godina pa nadalje. Također njezina obitelj je bila izrazito uključena i u slične ljevičarske organizacije. S obzirom da nam profesor dolazi iz Sjedinjenih Američkih Država, ja ću kasniji razgovor voditi na engleskom jeziku i zapravo predstaviti samoga profesora na engleskom. So Eric, I would like to send you a welcome, and I'm very grateful for you accepting our invitation here to Center for Women's Study in Zagreb. We met online also in Vienna, so as we spoke earlier, I was very excited when you told us something about Nada and the another female Croatian workers that were very involved in labor movement in America during the 30s and 40s in the US. I would like to share a short bio, if that is okay with you, just to introduce you to our listeners and viewers. So Eric Fure-Slocum is an associate professor in the history at St. Olaf College. And for me, it is very important that in his research, he's focusing on the 20th century American working class history, with especially interest in urban political culture. And the professor is also focused on inequality and social conflicts. Many courses that you, Eric, teach are incorporating an academic civil engagement project and opportunity to bring together academic and community-based work, which I think it is very important in the sense of Croatian historiography. I would also like to make a statement that you are the author of several books. Among them is Contesting the Postwar City, Working Class and Growing Politics in 1940s in Milwaukee, and you also co-edit with your colleagues a collection of the essay called Civic Labor, School Activism and Working Class Studies. If you had anything to add, Eric, please do. I was trying to make it short, but you have so many interest in academic, but also in this civil engagement. So if you like to add something that I didn't mention it in introduction, please do. No problem.
No, I think you covered it very well. But let me say thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I really am grateful, and it was a pleasure to meet you, although virtually, at that conference in Vienna. And I'm glad now to have this opportunity to continue this conversation. And I've learned. I had not expected when I just began this particular research that I was going to be going down the path of exploring so much Croatian American and Croatian historiography. And it's been a real pleasure to dive deeply into that literature. And it's a really fascinating literature that I'm continuing to learn from and look forward to future opportunities too. I know you did ask me earlier if I might say a few words about that mix of activism and and scholarship. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that first before we talk about the specific research project. So I began, before I became an academic, I was a community organizer and spent about a decade as a community organizer. Worked first in Duluth, Minnesota, which is actually a city that figures into this research that I'm doing to a small degree. And that was during the early 1980s when the steel industry was collapsing as well as a lot of other heavy industries. And so the working class neighborhoods we were working in, people were facing utility shutoffs, evictions, foreclosures, all sort of within a context of rising unemployment. So I did that for a number of years, and then I also worked with small family farmers during the 1980s farm crisis in the upper Midwest, and then later in California with both farm worker and small farmer organizations. So I brought all that with me as I went to graduate school and to study urban and labor history, and really that animated many of my questions, that involvement in those local communities. And as you know, right, social activism and labor history are wedded from the very beginning, particularly as we think about the new labor history. As you mentioned, I edited this collection, Civic Labors, and it's a volume that brings together labor historians, labor studies scholars, to think about how their scholarship, their teaching, and activism how they interact and are part of the same in the work that they do. One of the real pleasures of that volume was the opportunity to edit a talk that was given by the late David Montgomery, who in American labor history is certainly one of the real pioneers of new labor history. And he was a very serious historian that did serious archival research, but also an activist as well. And he in turn really trained a generation of labor historians who took that blend of activism and scholarship to heart, became effective activists, but became very effective scholars and teachers as well. So part of that, is what's informed me in my work and my teaching. You mentioned civic engagement, academic civic engagement, something that I've certainly integrated into my teaching. I was fortunate to work with a group of talented staff at St. Olaf to develop that program, which I've integrated into my classes. Students having the opportunity to work on elections, either as election judges, registering voters, or working for political campaigns. Most recently, one of the projects was working with a project out of Minneapolis called Mapping Prejudice, which gave students the opportunity to work with that project to code and basically research and then code racially restrictive covenants, and then develop a map of the city, seeing how that one tool, at least, of racial segregation became pervasive in the middle 20th century, and gave students a real sense of structural racism and how that's not just something that's on the landscape, but how it's built and constructed and then has long-term impacts as well. And then finally, in terms of activism and scholarship, I should say that a lot of my work recently has been around the issue of contingent faculty. As you are probably well aware, in the United States in the 1970s, 70% of faculty were tenure stream faculty. Now about 75% of faculty and academic workers are contingent faculty, adjuncts, lecturers, visiting faculty. And so I've worked with a number of organizations, including the Labor and Working Class History Association and the American Historical Association on that. And I'm currently editing a book with Claire Goldstein titled Contingent Faculty, A Labor History, and looking at that history, but also the organizing that contingent faculty have done in trying to address or change or better their working conditions.
Yeah.
So a long answer to your
It's okay. It's okay. I think it is very important in the sense when we are talking in the frame of Croatian historiography, because most of our historians, well, most, maybe not the most, but one significant part of Croatian historians are kind of having this thesis that academic work and community-based work are two different things. So if you're an academic, your job is to write, to present your books, to present your articles, and so on. And something that we call, or you call it, community-based work is kind of entitled as activism, and activism and academic work. They're two separate things. So we cannot mix them, because then we got political, we are not more objective in our work, and so on. So can you tell me something about your view on this thesis? Because here in Croatia, even I got some remarks that I'm not really historian, that I'm more activist and so on, because in my work I have some kind of political view. I've got some very strong thesis about some things and so on. And I also work with non-government organization and so on, which is kind of labeled as negative. Or so, can you tell me something about what do you think about that?
Yeah, and clearly you've done a lot of good thinking about this too. So I don't want to pretend to be an expert at it, but we all bring our present lives into our historical research, whether we're explicit about it or we're not. And so I think as long as we're clear about those present day questions, and then really dig into the archival research and really engage the evidence with integrity. And here again, I would point to somebody like David Montgomery as an example, who had been very active as a labor activist in his earlier life, continued to support and work for labor causes while he was a historian. But he approached that evidence with real integrity. And I think as long as we do that, and in some ways being explicit about our politics helps us to frame those questions more explicitly and more clearly. The other aspect is that being engaged in politics or being engaged in activism or with organizations in the community, it gives us a sense of power dynamics that we can be, if we're too divorced from that, we're just not bringing good questions to those historical sources. And so, again, it's not the end point, right? And we're not doing that scholarship only for the purpose of, if we're doing it for the purpose of only supporting a particular political side, then that's problematic. But if we're approaching it, again, with those questions and with a clear consciousness about how we're doing it, I think it can only strengthen the historical work that we're doing.
I completely agree with you. And now we will go on the focus of our podcast, and that is Croatian American women and their activism in America. In your research, you write about South Slavic organization, which very often were connected to the labor left group in America. When we talk about them, can you tell us something? What kind of the groups are we talking about, and how they influence in the American labor movement? Or another word, I know it's a complex question, but I hope you can answer it. What was the situation on American left in this period? Because we are talking about the interwar periods.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a great question, and really one that, as I began this research, and I had done earlier research on Milwaukee, especially in the 1940s and 1950s. This particular project drew me back more into the 1930s, and what I discovered was a remarkably rich organizational and community life. much of which intersected with labor left and radical politics. So here I'm going to be talking specifically about Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and thinking about some of the Croatian and other South Slavic organizations that were part of this sort of rich tapestry in this community. There certainly are many sort of social organizations and cultural organizations that were part of that scene, and churches in which Croatian language services were held and continue to be held today, in both Milwaukee and the nearby industrial suburb of West Allis. But what I particularly would focus on here is to think about some of those organizations that were especially involved in the political life and became key organizations in some of the labor organizing of the 1930s too. So of a special note is the Croatian Fraternal Union, or the CFU. It's an organization, and it was a national organization that was based in Pittsburgh and had a weekly newspaper called, and my apologies if my pronunciations don't quite hit it, but Zjednikar. And that was a weekly newspaper. During the 1930s, it also had a 4-page insert that was in English, but the paper at large was Croatian, in Croatian. And in Milwaukee, there were 6, it's a little hard to piece all of this together, but I think there were 6 Croatian Fraternal Union affiliated lodges in both Milwaukee and West Allis. And they really, one thing that they did is for people who were for workers in those communities, they offered somewhat of a cushion with some financial help during emergencies, and especially important, of course, during the Great Depression. And but they also, offered an opportunity to gather together with other Croatian Americans as well for both cultural, sports activities. They had really rich sports and athletic teams in softball, basketball, bowling, you name it. But then they also had, particularly by the mid 1930s, more of a political edge as well. And for the Croatian Fraternal Union, they had the motto "One for all for one." It really became an organization that featured a kind of ethnic pluralism that both rallied support for the New Deal and New Deal politics, New Deal policies, some of the relief programs and social movements that were connected to the New Deal, and fostered what some scholars have called an outward-looking working-class Americanization, right? So not disconnecting, right, from the Croatian American identity, but in a pluralist fashion of connecting it to a notion of becoming American, but becoming working class Americans. And that in turn really became an important cultural basis, but also an important organizational resource for the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the Industrial Union Federation that began its work in the mid 1930s and soon became really the dynamic force behind labor organizing in the United States during that period, and also then connected to important anti-fascist causes during the 1930s as well. So they would host a number of events. For instance, the Croatian Federation fraternal unions came together to sponsor annual Croatian American Day picnics in the summers that would bring thousands of people, and often bring union leaders as some of the keynote speakers. So Harold Christoffel, who was the leader of the militant United Auto Workers Local 248, that was the union at the Alice Chalmers plant, spoke at one of the summer gatherings at one of the picnics, and really celebrated the as he called it, the fraternalism displayed by Croatian groups, and really underscoring how central that was to that working class life in those communities, but also to the emergence and development of the CIO unions during this period. So those are particularly, I think, that's a particularly important part of this history. A number of other important organizations, though, as well, the American Slav Congress and the United Committee of South Slavic Americans, both which were formed after the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact collapsed, and both were active in the Milwaukee area with CFU members and others participating in that. The ASC, or the American Slav Congress, that sort of exhibited kind of transnational agenda and pan-Slavic agenda as well, that but also was rooted in unionism and really came out of the International Workers' Order, a communist-affiliated fraternal organization. And then the United Committee of South Slavic Americans, that was headed by the Slovenian writer and activist Louis Adamic, who really advocated a strong pro-labor and anti-fascist agenda for that organization. And again, that brought together many different Milwaukee, some 26 different Yugoslav lodges and societies in Milwaukee. So again, sort of that rich organizational life that's a part of that urban scene in that period.
Okay, so Eric, we are talking about people who departed from Yugoslavia in the 1990s, right, or 1920s, 1930s, and then came to US.
Yeah, well, they would include people who came even at the turn of the century, right, when that migration really started to increase, but also people in that period immediately before World War I, immediately after World War I, because of immigration restriction that really comes into place in 1924 with the National Origins Act. The stream of people coming into the United States begins to taper. Although, as we'll talk in a few minutes, there are people certainly still coming and part of that immigrant community. Yeah.
For us in Croatia, and for me particularly because of my research interest, is very important one Croatian American woman, and that is Nadi Oristo Husdon, right? Okay. She was born here in Croatia, right, in 1922. This is also very important for our historiography in the sense of the labor history and its female aspects, which is this is the area that has a lot of things to do yet. It's our historian job. But according to that, can you say something more about Nada and the kind of activism she was involved? She was on the left, of course. Okay, she was a labor activist, but what can you tell us something about her even more?
Sure. No, happy to do that. And maybe if we could turn to the second slide, and I'll just introduce her in this case. And so here's a newspaper article or photograph from the newspaper, the Milwaukee Journal, one of the main dailies in that city, from 1944 in the spring. And this is a collection of people who were organizing to collect names on a petition and to fight against people who were trying to keep this people who are trying to segregate this neighborhood. And it's a neighborhood in which Nadi Husdon lived and really had grown up as well. So Nadi Husdon is the person right in the middle of this photograph. She's sitting in the chair, sitting next to Eula Morris. And Eula Morris is, along with her husband, Edward, who's on the far right-hand side of the photograph. They, an African-American family that had moved into an apartment in the West Side 16th Ward in Milwaukee, and they were both war workers. So this is right in the middle of World War II. And there was a group then of people who wanted to keep the neighborhood or make this neighborhood segregated, led particularly by a realtor named Fred Bartel. And so we have this battle between people who wanted to segregate the neighborhood and people who wanted to really support the Morris family, and also supporting another housing project that would open up housing for African Americans in that area. So when I began this, I really had no idea who Nadi Husdon was, and she appeared in a few newspaper accounts as the wife of a serviceman who was speaking out in favor of the Morris family and against the segregationists. And in this conflict in the spring of 1944, she was attacked as being a renter, and almost sort of the suggestion that she was an outsider. And she clearly was a close ally with the head of the NAACP, one of the civil rights organizations that was also advocating. As I began to explore this event, what struck me initially was the important role of labor activists in this. Number of people who were involved in CIO unions, including the United Auto Workers. But then, who was Nadi Husdon, right? And I had no idea. I eventually found out that she had a maiden name, or her name before being Nadi Husdon was Nadi Oristo. And so just started to use some of the there was really not much more in terms of source material immediately available. So started to explore some of the social history and genealogical sources to discover a little bit more about her. She was only 21 at the time of this photograph and at the time of this event, probably turning 22 shortly after that. So, my mission was in part to learn about various people that were involved in this, and Nadi Husdon proved to be an especially interesting research task, and really then became part of this research project that I ventured into. So let me just say, I learned early on that she became involved in communist affiliated and Popular Front organizations. She was the local secretary for the American Youth for Democracy, which was the successor organization to the Young Communist League. But as I began to then explore her background, I learned a lot more about her Croatian heritage and Croatian origins. So let me just say a little bit about her biography, if I can, that then gets us back again to this 1944 set of incidents. She was born as Nadi Goldner in 1922 in Susak, which is it's part of present-day Rijeka, and her sister Zlata was born there a year earlier. Her mother was Paulina Tomljanovic. She came from Gorski Kotar, a mountainous area nearby. Her father, Rudolfo Goldner, had been born further east in the Slavonian region, right. Yes, exactly. Slavonian region of Croatia. The name Goldner is the last name, evidently comes from Rudolfo's mother, who was Jewish. She and her Catholic and his Catholic father never married, and he ended up taking his mother's name. Both Rudolfo and Paulina then are growing up in Croatia and the areas of Austria-Hungary. They married in 1920. And just with that life, they witnessed war. They witnessed the dissolution of an empire, the post-war founding of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, or Yugoslavia. He then decided in 1923 to come to the United States. And it's important that year he came just to the year before the very restrictive National Origins Act was passed in the United States. Made his way to Duluth. It appears that some of Paulina's family had preceded him to that area. His brother-in-law had been killed in a steel mill accident just a few years before that. So he made his way to Duluth and then eventually made his way to Milwaukee in probably the later 1920s and became a citizen in the spring of 1929. Also very important in terms of then he was able to bring the rest of his family to the United States despite the restrictions on immigration. So Paulina and the two daughters traveled by way of Trieste to New York City and then made their way finally to Milwaukee. They then became citizens soon after arriving. And another interesting twist, right, to the story is that they also changed their surname at that point. Rudolfo took the name, and the rest of his family took the name Oristo as their last name, and that's because of Rudolfo's great interest in Esperanto. So Oristo is the equivalent to Goldner, meaning goldsmith, but in Esperanto. I think he had a 6th grade or 8th grade education, but spoke 7 languages and clearly had a real love for languages and interest in languages as well. Both parents were probably very sympathetic to socialism, and maybe one thing that attracted them to Milwaukee was the presence of a socialist mayor during that period, and earlier socialist mayor as well in Milwaukee. Rudolfo also seems to have become active early on in the Communist Party and in labor unions, first the American Federation of Labor and then the CIO as well. They were also very active in the Croatian and South Slavic organizations in Milwaukee. As I said, there's not a lot of documentary evidence about Nada herself. So part of what I have to work with is trying to contextualize her childhood, both with what I can discover through sources about her parents, and there's a bit more about her father than her mother. Sadly, right? The archives are a bit more silent, right, about Paulina than they are about Rudolfo. But to contextualize them in also that Croatian American community in this neighborhood of the 16th Ward, which I'll talk about in just a moment. The other, I have been able to talk to Zlata's and Nada's daughters. So I had a brief interview with them, which was fascinating. The mothers didn't talk a lot about this period in their life, and the daughters knew nothing about the incidents in 1944. So they were very pleased to learn about this. They certainly have inherited their mother's progressive politics. So we're glad to hear her mother's siding with civil rights organizations at a very earlier period. There is an extensive record by the FBI, which the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which I've put in a Freedom of Information Act request to try to get at what the FBI has on Nada Hudson, her husband, on Zlata and her husband. And there are thousands of pages, evidently, but because of the backlog, the first that I'll probably see of any of that is more than 3 years out, and probably not until a decade because there's such a backlog. So just a little bit on source material too. I can talk a little bit more about the setting unless you have other questions right now.
No, please do. Please, I'm very interesting regarding the settings and labor movement and so on in US and this.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, one of the things that's I think notable about their growing up, and maybe if we go to the next slide, on the PowerPoint, is this map of Milwaukee, and if you can see the area that I'm really focused on, there's a little bit of yellow highlight there on a portion of what's the 16th ward. It's a west side ward in this industrial city, but as you can see, it's not too far from the center. And these two neighborhoods, Merrill Park and Pigsville, which are neighborhoods right along the river valley, right? And that's important because that's where industries and heavy industry really established themselves, along with the railroad yards. And so these are neighborhoods that are filled with working class people who are working in heavy industry. Some people are commuting on the streetcars and buses to other industries and large industrial enterprises, for instance, in West Dallas as well. But it's a neighborhood and an area of the city that's both filled with working class people, but filled with many immigrants and children of immigrants as well, especially Southern, Eastern, and Central Europeans. Importantly, though, in this community, there is also a small African-American community, especially that were working in the factories and the railroad yards. It's in the southeastern corner of Merrill Park, or the southeastern corner of the 16th ward. And it's not a large community, right? But notable, because American cities are, as you probably well know, very segregated. Not just the South, but in the North, especially in these northern industrial cities. And so most African Americans in Milwaukee during this time lived just north of the central city. Here was another community that was just to the west of the central city. And in that corner of the 16th ward, but interestingly, that's also where Nadi Oristo and her family first lived. And they moved around a lot, but always within that 16th ward area. So they knew this community very well. She was very well established in this community by the time she was 21, and part of the civil rights disputes and conflicts during that period. And I think it's important that she, to recognize that she grew up in this both mixed ethnic and mixed racial neighborhood. It's not unlikely that on a regular basis, she was navigating in this neighborhood where both white and Black Americans were going to work, they were going to school, they were shopping, and unlike many in other neighborhoods in the city, that she had, to some degree, at least this a mixed race experience that may have had an important experience. It's also a community that has a strong union presence as well. Right? This is a neighborhood in which, especially after the CIO begins organizing in the mid-1930s, there are a lot of CIO members in this neighborhood, and that CIO culture of unity, which is something that the CIO emphasized, both for to cross ethnic lines that had been exploited by employers, but also to cross racial lines that also had been exploited by employers to keep workers disorganized. That certainly informed people in this neighborhood, and as did the Croatian Fraternal Union, right? And its working class pluralism that it exhibited as well. So I think locating her within this neighborhood is part of that story, an important part of that story.
Yeah. So she was I would say, like a pretty big role she was having in American labor movement, because she was on FBI, as I understand you, on the FBI list, right?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's not a name that's prominent by any means, and I think hopefully by writing part of this history, we'll start to recognize the role and place of women like Nadi Husdon in both the labor movement and the labor left movement in the United States. But she's it's not a name that would have been known very widely in Milwaukee history, except if people had gone back in the newspapers and seen a few pictures of her and a few accounts that include her name, and certainly not in the national story. But I think it is part of what we need to do in writing these local stories and those local histories, is to understand the complexity of those stories, but also the role of women like Nadi Husdon and what they played in this. The other part that I would say, though, but given the attention given to Nadi Husdon and to her husband and her sister and her brother-in-law, again, they're not sort of major players, but it gives us a sense then of how significant, in a sense, the surveillance state was, and how much it was focused on labor and left-wing activists, right? The attention, the sort of inordinate amount of resources sort of spent on them, unless there's something there that I've not discovered yet that gave even better cause. It gives us a sense of what the Cold War really means for the American left, and how chilling an effect it had. Because when you see a family being surveilled to that degree, it's really quite remarkable.
Yeah. Partially you have already answered, but I will ask you maybe broader. How big was the influence of Croatian American women on the American left or the labor movement, except Nada, as you have spoken of? Was there any other women?
I think this is a history that needs to be written. To be honest, I don't want to give I don't want to give too definitive an answer on that. I think it's a story that needs to be written, but somebody needs to do, in the way that Jennifer Guglielmo has done for the Italian American historiography and looking at women's role on the American left and the Italian American community. We need a lot more research into this and a lot more thinking about this. There's been some good work done on the Croatian Fraternal Union and its role on the American left, and that's a good starting point. Local stories like this are good starting points. There's some oral histories, not many, but a few that we can tap into that have been done. There's an old collection by the Linds, that Stoughton Lind, that he conducted, called Rank and File, many years ago, that includes an account by a Croatian American woman who was an activist on the left and in labor movement. But we sort of can count on our hands on a hand or two the number of sort of works that are out there. So I would say we need the research. We need much more being done on that.
Also, this is, I think it's an opportunity to kind of create some kind of project from historian in Croatia for you and so on. So this is kind of opportunity for some kind of collaboration in this area.
That's right. And I think, part of that research is going to, I'm not a Croatian speaker.
I am.
Yes, I know you are. And so I think, some of the sources are not in English, and so many of the sources are in Croatian. And I think, part of what we need is we need people with the language skills to be able to work with those sources.
Yeah.
I can look at the 4-page inset in Zajednikar, and that's helpful for research. And I can use Google Translate to a degree, but either I need to develop my language skills, or teaming up with people who want to engage in this kind of research. And it's important research.
Yeah, I think also, and as I have said it earlier, it's a great opportunity for some kind of collaboration between
Yeah.
American historians and Croatian historians.
Yeah.
And in the end, I would ask you some question maybe that is broader than everything we were talking about previous. But when we talk about the American left in this period, interwar period, can you tell me what, in your opinion, what are the key points that you would like to emphasize, maybe?
Sure. Yeah. A few things. Again, I think there's much that we still need to learn. There's a great deal of good work that's out there, but as I delved into this particular facet of it, there's a lot we still don't know. But one is that labor is central. As we're thinking about the left during this period, labor is central, both the ways in which other left organizations supported labor, but labor really facilitated left organizations and the vitality of those organizations. The other is that migration and the impact of a changing industrial and service workforce is also central as well. As we look at the United States and think about this period. Yes, migration did begin to tail off during this period, although we still see people coming, and those second and third generations, they have an impact as well, but also the organizations and the organizational life that was developed by that first generation too. I guess a third would be that anti-fascism needs to be sort of brought centrally into this picture, and really did both facilitate popular front coalitions, but also really animated many on the left, and really brought people into left and labor organizations during this period. I think we have, there's some good recent scholarship on anti-fascism, as there's been more attention recently to fascism in the United States, and we need to bring that into it. But also then are the sort of varied local histories, right? Milwaukee is an interesting case because of municipal socialism. It's not the only case in which we see municipal socialism, but we do have these very varied local histories that are important to figure into it. At the same time, and this goes back to an earlier point maybe, working more and more attention to transnational histories in thinking about the American left, and how significant, the migration of people was to that transnational history, and ideas about how to organize, or ideas that would animate organization. And here I'll just put in a quick plug for my mentor's book that's coming out this fall, Shel Stromquist, a great labor historian and a student of David Montgomery, who I spoke about earlier. He's got a book called Claiming the City, A Global History of Workers' Fight for Municipal Socialism, where he is looking at municipal socialism in the US, in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, and really bringing together some important stories there, and focused on that local level as well, though. Maybe a couple of other quick points. One is that, as we were just saying before, the tremendous pressures that were put on the left, especially with the emergence of the Cold War, we need to never lose sight of that, and how that then shaped the left, and those many pages of FBI surveillance of Nadi Hudson and her family, I think are a good indication of that. And of course, then we don't want to romanticize the American left, but there's a lot that we can do to learn from its mistakes, but also from its good work as well.
Well, Eric, thank you very much once again for accepting our invitation. I think we have covered most of the important things. Of course, we have a lot of other topics to talk, but I think it is very important that you were talking about academic and community-based work and importance of that. Then we talk about Nada. I think that our viewers and listeners would be very interested in this in this topic. Also about American left, I think you said something very important things, because here we are most focused on European history and so on. American left kind of is left on the side, I would say. So thank you, Eric. I hope we will meet again in live, and that we will have an opportunity to work together on this project, maybe on some another project. That I think, as you have pointed out, there is still a lot of things to research, a lot of things to think about, and a lot of things to write about.
Yes, indeed. And thanks for this opportunity. I really enjoyed the chance to talk today.
Thank you, Eric, once again, and bye-bye.
Okay, bye now.